Lucien adjusted his collar for the third time, his fingers fumbling with the button on his wrinkled white shirt. A small mirror in the studio showed his reflection, a man with unkempt, wavy hair and a shadow of fatigue under his brown eyes. His hands, perpetually rough from sculpting, rested briefly on the edge of the mirror as he let out a sigh. Jules had been relentless in setting him up for this blind date, insisting he needed to live a little, instead of spending every waking hour in his cramped studio. Lucien wasn't so sure. What could he possibly offer someone, apart from anecdotes of clay mishaps and unfinished commissions? Yet, there he was, attempting to smooth down the wrinkles in his thrift store blazer. The bistro Jules had chosen was one of those places Lucien normally passed by without a second glance. Its warm, inviting glow spilled onto the cobblestone streets of Montmartre, beckoning couples and groups of friends alike. Through the large glass windows, he could see the faint shimmer of fairy lights draped around the ceiling and the subtle sway of the pianist's hands over the keys. The atmosphere whispered of romance and indulgence, far removed from Lucien's world of plaster dust and solitude. As he stepped inside, the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with hints of rosemary and garlic. He immediately felt out of place among patrons in tailored suits and flowing dresses. His scuffed brown shoes squeaked faintly on the polished floors, and he muttered an apology to no one in particular. The host, a tall man with a practiced smile, gestured toward the far end of the room where Jules had assured him his date would be waiting. "Table 9, Lucien said, his voice low, barely audible over the hum of conversation and the delicate notes of jazz. "Right this way," the host replied, leading him through the maze of tables. Lucien's heart thumped harder with each step. When they reached the table, a woman sat alone, absently running a finger around the rim of her wineglass. Her dark brown hair was swept into a loose bun, and her dress, a simple yet elegant silk number in a deep emerald shade, made her stand out, though she seemed unaware of it. "Emilia?" Lucien asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. The woman looked up, startled but not unpleasantly so. Her hazel eyes softened as they met his. She studied him for a brief moment, her gaze flicking to his rumpled shirt and slightly too long blazer, before she smiled, a faint, almost mischievous curve of her lips. "Yes," she said, deciding on impulse to go along with it. "I'm Emilia." Lucien exhaled, relieved. "I'm Lucien. It's, nice to meet you." He held out his hand, then quickly withdrew it, realizing the awkwardness of the gesture. Emilia chuckled softly and motioned for him to sit. Their first few exchanges were polite but stilted. Lucien fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, his nervousness bubbling to the surface. Emilia found herself suppressing a grin as he tried, unsuccessfully, to fold his large hands neatly in front of him. There was something endearing about the way he stumbled through his words, as though his sincerity was too big for his sentences to contain. "So, you're an artist?" Emilia asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was light, curious. Lucien's face lit up slightly, his shoulders relaxing as he nodded. "A sculptor, mostly. It's nothing glamorous, just pieces for galleries here and there. Sometimes commissions." His fingers twitched, mimicking the movement of shaping clay. "I'm working on this series about Paris, how the city feels more than how it looks. You know, the texture of it." "The texture of Paris," Emilia repeated, her voice soft. She leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "That's beautiful. Do you find it hard to translate feelings into form?" "Sometimes," Lucien admitted, his gaze drifting briefly to the candle flickering between them. "But I think that's why I love it. It's like chasing something you'll never fully catch, but knowing the attempt itself is what matters." He stopped abruptly, realizing how earnest he sounded, and laughed nervously. "Sorry, I'm rambling. I do that when I talk about art." "No," Emilia said quickly, her eyes sparkling. "Please, go on. It's refreshing. Most people I meet only talk about what they do to impress. You talk about what you love." Lucien flushed, uncertain how to respond. Well, what about you? What do you do? The question caught Emilia off guard. She hesitated, the weight of her secret identity pressing down on her for a fleeting moment. I'm in arts management, she said carefully. It wasn't a complete lie. She managed galleries and museums as part of her role in the family business, mostly helping artists get noticed. Lucien's eyes lit up. That's amazing. It must feel great to help people like that. Emilia nodded, though the simplicity of his assumption struck her. Most people she encountered would have pried, asked about names and places, but Lucien seemed content with the surface of her answer. It does, she said. But I imagine it's not as hands-on as what you do. Sculpting seems, she searched for the right word. Grounding. Lucien chuckled. That's one way to put it. Mostly, it's messy. My studio looks like a hurricane hit it, and I'm usually covered in clay by noon. I'd like to see that someday, Emilia said before she could stop herself. A hint of pink crept into her cheeks as Lucien blinked in surprise. You're welcome anytime, he said, his voice soft, almost reverent, as though the idea of someone wanting to see his work left him momentarily unmoored. The conversation ebbed and flowed with surprising ease after that. Lucien shared stories of failed projects and unexpected inspirations, his words laced with self-deprecating humor and bursts of poetic insight. Emilia, for her part, listened intently, offering quiet encouragement. She found herself captivated by his authenticity, his lack of pretension, and the way he seemed to see the world in layers of meaning others often missed. By the time their plates were cleared, the initial awkwardness had melted away. Lucien leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at his lips. This has been really nice, he said, his voice tinged with a kind of wonder. Thank you. Emilia's smile deepened. It has. And thank you for, well, being you. As they stood to leave, Lucien offered to walk Emilia to the corner where she could catch a cab. The cool Parisian air wrapped around them as they stepped outside, the city's lights casting a golden hue over the cobblestone streets. Emilia glanced at Lucien, her heart unexpectedly light. She had expected an ordinary evening, but instead, she found herself intrigued and unable to tell him the truth. It was too much fun going along with his mistake, although she did feel a little bit bad about it. Lucien, oblivious to the empire Emilia had kept hidden, simply felt grateful. As they exchanged goodbyes, he tucked his hands into his pockets and watched her leave, a small, quiet thought blooming in his mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, Jules had been right. Emilia unlocked the door to her Parisian apartment, the faint click echoing in the quiet space as she slipped off her heels and set her bag on the sleek console table by the entrance. The apartment was as composed as she usually appeared, minimalist furniture in soft tones, artfully placed sculptures, and walls adorned with abstract paintings that made her feel less alone. But tonight, her sense of control felt slightly frayed. She walked to the large windows overlooking the glittering city, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her name wasn't Emilia. She replayed the moment in the bistro when a stranger had approached her table, his nervous expression softening as he said, "Emilia?" In that brief moment, bored and uninspired by her otherwise predictable evening, she had chosen to be someone else. She had become Emilia, confident, charming, and unburdened by the expectations that usually followed her real name, Margot. Margot, heiress to an empire, a name whispered in elite circles, attached to a life she often wished she could set aside. Emilia, on the other hand, had been free. A blank slate to project whatever she wanted. At first, the lie had felt harmless. It wasn't as if the date would lead to anything serious. But she hadn't anticipated how much she would enjoy her evening with Lucien. He had been disarmingly sincere. His clumsy charm, his quiet passion for his art, the way he lit up when describing his dream of opening a studio, it had all surprised her. And then there was the way he looked at her, like she was the most interesting person in the room. Not because of her reputation, her wealth, or her last name, but simply for being there, for listening, for being Emilia. A faint pang of guilt crept in as she curled up on her sofa with a glass of wine. She had lied to Lucien, a perfect stranger who had done nothing to deserve it. Yet, as the thought of seeing him again flickered through her mind, a small smile played at her lips. Perhaps she could keep being Emilia, just for a little longer. Across the city, Lucien kicked off his shoes as he stepped into his cluttered apartment. The faint scent of clay and paint greeted him, along with the half-finished sculptures scattered across his workspace. He dropped onto his couch, exhausted but strangely light. He hadn't expected much from the blind date, especially after Jules had practically dragged him into it. But the woman he had met, Emilia, wasn't what he'd imagined at all. She was poised but approachable, with a quiet confidence that made her seem almost untouchable, yet she had listened so intently when he spoke about his art. Lucien found himself replaying their conversation, the way her hazel eyes had sparkled with curiosity, the way her laugh had softened the sharp edges of his nerves. The buzzing of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Jules. Well? Jules's voice burst through the line, full of excitement. How did it go? Lucien leaned back, propping his feet on the coffee table. It was good, actually. Good. Jules echoed, incredulous. That's it? After all my effort, all I get is good? Lucien laughed. She was nice. Really nice, actually. A little different from what I expected, but in a good way. Different how? Jules asked, curiosity piqued. Lucien hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't know. She seemed confident, but not in a showy way. Thoughtful, curious, really easy to talk to. There was a pause on the other end. That's weird, Jules said slowly. Lucien frowned. What's weird? It's just that Emilia, the Emilia I set you up with, isn't exactly like that. She's a bit more reserved, shy even. I'm not saying people can't surprise you, but what you're describing. I don't know. It doesn't sound like her. Lucien leaned forward, confusion creeping in. You're sure it was the right table? The host took me to table 9. Yes, that was the table, Jules said, but his tone was uncertain now. Maybe you just brought out a side of her I haven't seen. Or maybe you're just bad at reading people. He laughed, trying to lighten the mood. Lucien chuckled too, though a flicker of doubt remained. Well, either way, it was a good night. I'm actually thinking about seeing her again. Now that's what I like to hear. Jules said, his enthusiasm returning full force. See? I told you this whole blind date thing wasn't such a bad idea. You just needed a push. Thanks for the push, Lucien said, his voice warm despite the lingering question in his mind. After they hung up, Lucien stared at the ceiling, his thoughts wandering back to Emilia, or whoever she was. Jules's comments gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. Maybe Jules didn't know her as well as he thought. People could be surprising, after all. Meanwhile, Margot, Emilia, stood by her window, gazing at the lights of Paris. The city hummed with life, a steady rhythm that matched her own restless thoughts. She felt a strange pull to see Lucien again, despite the tangled web she had begun to weave. For now, she decided, she could stay Emilia. Just a little longer. The small art gallery nestled in the heart of Montmartre hummed with a quiet energy. Its exposed brick walls were lined with paintings and sculptures that felt more like whispers than declarations, each piece begging the viewer to lean in and listen closely. The soft glow of antique sconces illuminated the space, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere that drew visitors into its embrace. Lucien stood near the center of the room, his hands shoved into his pockets, feeling a little out of place among the more polished attendees. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Emilia, who was studying a minimalist painting with the kind of attention most people reserved for priceless artifacts. She turned at just the right moment, her hazel eyes catching his. Her lips curved into a gentle smile, and Lucien felt the room narrow until it was just the two of them. She made her way toward him with a grace that seemed effortless, her emerald green dress swaying slightly with each step. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that eased some of his nerves. "Neither was I," Lucien admitted, returning her smile. "But I figured if I'm going to understand what makes someone like you tick, this might be the place to start." Her laughter was quiet but genuine. "And what makes you think I'm such a mystery?" "Let's just say you're not exactly easy to pin down," he replied, his tone light but his gaze searching. "You seem like someone who knows a lot more than they let on." Emilia tilted her head, considering him. "That's quite an observation for someone who barely knows me." Lucien shrugged. "It's just a feeling. Am I wrong?" Instead of answering, she gestured toward a sculpture nearby, a piece made of twisted metal that seemed to defy logic in the way it balanced precariously, yet somehow stood firm. "What do you see when you look at this?" she asked, changing the subject. Lucien's brow furrowed as he stepped closer, his attention shifting entirely to the work. "Struggle," he said after a moment. "And resilience. It's like the artist was trying to show how fragile things can still hold their own, even when they're bending under pressure." Emilia studied him as he spoke, the way his eyes darted over the sculpture with a mix of curiosity and reverence. He wasn't looking at it like an object. He was looking at it like it had a heartbeat. "Art is fascinating that way, isn't it?" she said. "It holds up a mirror, but instead of showing us our faces, it shows us our insides. The parts we try to hide, even from ourselves." Lucien turned to her, his expression softening. "Exactly. It's not about what's perfect or pretty. It's about what's real." For a moment, Emilia felt exposed, as though he had reached inside her carefully constructed armor and seen something she wasn't ready to reveal. She cleared her throat, gesturing toward another piece, a painting this time. "Do you ever think about sharing more of your own work with the world?" He hesitated, his shoulders tensing slightly. "I don't know if the world's ready for what I have to say." "I think you underestimate yourself," she said. "Your perspective is worth sharing." Lucien glanced at her, his lips twitching into a small, uncertain smile. "Coming from someone like you, that means a lot." She almost flinched at the phrase. He didn't know what someone like her actually meant. To him, she was just a woman standing in a gallery, offering him encouragement. If he knew the truth, that she could open doors in the art world with a single phone call, would he still look at her this way? Would his words carry the same sincerity? She pushed the thought aside, determined not to ruin the moment. As they wandered through the gallery, their conversation deepened. Lucien spoke with unguarded passion about his dream of opening a community art studio, a place where young talent could thrive without the constraints of judgment or financial barriers. "There's so much potential out there," he said, his hands gesturing animatedly. "People who could do incredible things if someone just gave them the tools and the space. That's what I want to create, a space where they can try, fail, and grow." Emilia listened intently, her heart tightening with admiration. His humility, his drive, it was magnetic. She felt a pang of guilt for not being honest about her connections, for not offering the help she knew he needed. But the fear of altering how he saw her kept her silent. She didn't want to be another benefactor in his life. She wanted to be someone he could trust, someone who mattered for reasons beyond her resources. "You really believe in people," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. Lucien shrugged, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "I just know what it's like to have someone believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. My mom used to say that everyone's got something worth sharing, even if they don't know it yet." Emilia smiled, imagining the kind of woman who could instill such hope in her son. "She sounds like a remarkable person." "She was," Lucien said softly, a shadow passing over his face. She's the reason I started sculpting. It was something we could do together when things got tough. After she passed, it became my way of keeping her close. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made Amelia's chest ache. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but something in his posture told her he wasn't looking for sympathy. He had built his life around this pain, turned it into something beautiful. As the evening wore on, the gallery began to empty, but neither of them seemed eager to leave. Outside, the Parisian night was cool and quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of street lamps. They lingered near the entrance, neither ready to say goodbye. "This was nice," Lucien said, his voice low, almost shy. "I wasn't sure what to expect tonight, but I'm glad I came." Amelia met his gaze, her heart fluttering in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too." She hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing heavily on her. There was so much she wanted to tell him, but fear held her back. Instead, she simply smiled, a bittersweet expression that hinted at everything she wasn't ready to say. As Lucien turned to leave, Amelia watched him go, her chest tightening with a mix of longing and uncertainty. Something about him made her feel alive in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in years. And yet, the walls she had built around her life seemed insurmountable. She took a deep breath, watching his figure disappear into the night, and wondered what it would take to bridge the gap between the worlds they came from. The café on Rue de l'Abreuvoir buzzed with its usual charm, the warm hum of voices and clinking cups wrapping the room in coziness. Lucien sat at their usual table near the window, but tonight the familiar setting didn't bring him any comfort. His phone lay face down on the table, its screen still burning in his mind, replaying the image that had shattered the fragile trust he'd been building. It had started innocently enough, scrolling through his feed while idly wondering what Amelia was doing. That was when he saw it. A picture of her. Not Amelia. Margot. She stood poised, radiant in a sleek designer gown, alongside two men in tailored suits. The caption read, "Margot Moreau, heir to the Moreau art legacy, at last night's gala." His stomach had twisted at the realization. The name was unmistakable, as was the face. It was her. But she wasn't Amelia, the down-to-earth woman who'd shared stories about art and life. She was Margot Moreau, an heiress, a socialite, and one of the wealthiest women in Paris. A few quick searches had filled in the rest, articles about her family's fortune, her influence in the art world, and her connections to the very elite circles he could barely imagine. And now she was walking toward him, her familiar dark brown hair loose around her shoulders, a soft beige coat wrapped snugly around her. She caught his eye, offering the same warm smile that had disarmed him so many times before. "Lucien," she said brightly, taking a seat across from him. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Is everything okay?" He studied her for a long moment, unsure where to begin. "I thought it was," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" He flipped the phone over, unlocking it with a swipe before turning the screen toward her. The image of her as Margot Moreau stared back, the glow of her curated life glaring in stark contrast to the modest setting of the café. Her eyes widened as she took in the picture, her hand instinctively reaching toward the screen before stopping midway. "Lucien," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. "Why lie to me? Why pretend to be someone else?" She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she rested them on the table. "I wasn't pretending, not about the things that mattered." "Not about the things that mattered," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "You lied about your name, about who you are. Everything I thought I knew about you, it was all a game, wasn't it? A bored, wealthy girl playing with a poor mouse for her own amusement." "No," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan any of this, Lucien. I didn't set out to lie to you." "Then what was it?" he demanded, leaning forward. Because when I sat down at that table, you could have told me the truth. But instead, you pretended to be someone else. You let me open up to you while keeping this huge part of yourself hidden. Why? She looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. Because I wanted to escape, she admitted, her voice soft. That night, when you came to the table, I was bored. Lonely, even. I thought it would be harmless to go along with it, to be someone else for a little while. And then, she looked up, her hazel eyes shimmering. And then I met you. You were so genuine, so different from anyone I'd met before. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to tell you the truth without ruining everything. Lucien let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. You thought lying was better? That I wouldn't find out? Did you think I was so insignificant, so beneath you, that it wouldn't matter? No, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't think that at all. I was scared. Scared that if you knew who I really was, you'd treat me differently. You'd see the name Moreau and think of all the things I hate being associated with: money, privilege, power. I didn't want that with you. But that's who you are, isn't it? He shot back. You are Margot Moreau. You're not just some ordinary woman who loves art. You're an heiress, for crying out loud. Your family owns more art than most museums. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Yes, that's part of who I am, she admitted. But it's not all I am. I thought. I hoped you'd see that. How could I? Lucien asked, his voice quieter now but still heavy with emotion. You never gave me the chance. You decided for me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. You're right, she said. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And I'm sorry, Lucien. I'm sorry I lied to you. But the way I feel about you, the way I've felt since the moment we started talking, that was never a lie. He looked at her, his heart warring with itself. He wanted to believe her, to see the sincerity in her eyes as proof of her remorse. But the sting of betrayal was still fresh, and the gap between their worlds felt wider than ever. I don't know if I can believe you, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can trust anything you've said. Her breath hitched, her tears spilling over now. I understand, she whispered. And if you never want to see me again, I'll respect that. But I swear to you, Lucien, I never meant to hurt you. He didn't respond, his silence a wall she couldn't climb. After a moment, she stood, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. Goodbye, Lucien, she said softly, her voice breaking as she turned and walked toward the door. The bell chimed softly as she left, her figure disappearing into the Parisian night. Lucien sat there, staring at the empty space she'd left behind, his chest tight with the weight of what had just happened. Outside, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the unraveling of something fragile and full of possibility. Lucien waited awkwardly at a small café near Montmartre, fiddling with the silverware as the afternoon light spilled through the window. Jules had been insistent, borderline relentless, about fixing the misunderstanding with the real Amelia. Apparently, she'd spent her evening at the bistro convinced she'd been stood up, her blind date nowhere in sight. Jules had explained the mix-up, laughing at the absurdity of Lucien's accidental rendezvous with Margot Moreau. She's perfect for you, Jules had said, his grin wide and conspiratorial. Don't let a simple mistake ruin this. Meet her, give her a chance. Now, as the door to the café opened, Lucien looked up to see Amelia. She was petite, with soft features and shoulder-length blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She wore a pale blue blouse that complemented her light complexion and walked with a gentle air of composure. When their eyes met, she smiled politely, a flicker of curiosity and hesitation in her expression. Lucien? She asked, her voice soft. He stood, nodding. That's me. And you must be Amelia. I'm sorry about the, confusion. She laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It's not every day your blind date ends up meeting someone else by accident. I wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. Lucien smiled apologetically as they sat down. Trust me, it wasn't intentional. Jules didn't exactly provide clear instructions. Their conversation started smoothly enough. Emilia worked in interior design, a job she described with genuine passion. She talked about her recent projects, how she loved transforming small, overlooked spaces into something meaningful. Her stories were punctuated with soft laughter, and she seemed genuinely interested when Lucien spoke about his art and his dream of opening a community studio. But despite the pleasantness of the date, Lucien felt distant, like he was observing everything from behind a pane of glass. He responded politely, laughed at her jokes, and asked thoughtful questions, yet his mind wandered. No matter how hard he tried to focus, his thoughts kept drifting to Margot. He couldn't shake the memory of her sitting across from him, her hazel eyes sparkling with interest as they talked about art. The way she had challenged his assumptions and matched his passion with her own insights. Even now, knowing the lies she had told, he couldn't deny the connection he'd felt. Lucien? Emilia's voice cut through his thoughts, and he blinked, realizing she was waiting for a response. Sorry, he said quickly. What were you saying? She smiled, a little uncertain. I was just asking if you've ever thought about working with designers. Your sculptures would be amazing in curated spaces. Oh, right, he said, nodding. That's an interesting idea. I guess I've always thought of my work as more personal, but maybe collaborating could open new doors. Emilia's smile widened, clearly pleased with his answer. I'd love to see your pieces in a setting like that. They have so much presence. Lucien thanked her, but the words felt hollow. The more he tried to engage, the more he realized something was missing. Emilia was kind, intelligent, and perfectly pleasant. Yet, there was no spark, no sense of depth that made him want to know everything about her. Maybe it was the circumstances, he told himself. Maybe if they'd met under different conditions, he wouldn't feel this nagging sense of detachment. They lingered over their coffees for a while longer, talking about Paris, their favorite places to escape the city's bustle, and their shared love for quiet corners where creativity could breathe. But even as Emilia spoke animatedly about a little cafe she adored, Lucien found himself picturing Margot instead, her soft laugh, the way her hair framed her face, the unguarded moments she had shared despite the lies. As the date wound down, Lucien walked Emilia to the metro station. The evening air was cool, and the soft glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. She thanked him for a lovely time, her smile warm but reserved, as if she sensed the hesitation he hadn't been able to mask. I'm glad we got to meet, finally, she said, her voice genuine. Me too, Lucien replied, though the words didn't feel entirely true. They exchanged polite goodbyes, and Lucien watched as she descended the stairs into the metro. For a moment, he considered calling Jules and telling him the date had gone well. It had, technically. There was nothing wrong with Emilia, she was charming and kind. But that was just it, she was nice. Pleasant. Agreeable. She wasn't Margot. Lucien hated himself for thinking it. Margot had lied, and that betrayal still stung. But she had also been vibrant, challenging, and unapologetically herself beneath the pretense. With her, conversations had felt electric, her insight sparking something in him he hadn't realized he was missing. He walked home slowly, the crisp air biting at his cheeks. When he reached his tiny apartment, he stepped inside and sank onto the couch, his head falling into his hands. The evening replayed in his mind, not because it had been particularly memorable, but because of what it had made him realize. No matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't stop thinking about Margot. He thought about the way her expression had softened when she'd spoken about art, how her vulnerability had peeked through her polished exterior when she'd finally admitted the truth. He hated the lies, but he couldn't ignore the moments of real connection they had shared. Lucien leaned back, staring at the ceiling as frustration bubbled up in his chest. He didn't want to feel this way. Margot had made a fool of him, and he should be glad to leave her behind. But the thought of never seeing her again, never finishing the conversation they had started, left an ache he couldn't explain. With a sigh, he grabbed his sketchbook from the coffee table. His hands moved absent-mindedly, charcoal dragging across the page, the lines forming before he realized what he was drawing. When he pulled back, the image staring back at him was unmistakable, a face with soft hazel eyes and a mix of strength and regret etched into its features. Lucien tossed the sketch aside and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain: he couldn't pretend Margot wasn't still on his mind. Lucien's studio was a symphony of chaos. Tools lay scattered across workbenches, bits of clay clung to every surface, and half-finished sculptures stood like forgotten sentinels. The air carried the earthy scent of wet clay mixed with the faint metallic tang of dust, a testament to hours of labor and bursts of inspiration. Lucien was hunched over a block of marble, his chisel in hand, but the motions lacked their usual purpose. He had been at it for hours, but nothing had taken shape. His thoughts were too tangled, his heart too heavy. The knock on the door startled him. He frowned, setting the chisel down with a dull clink. Visitors were rare, and he wasn't in the mood for interruptions. Wiping his hands on a rag, he crossed the room and opened the door, expecting a courier or a neighbor. Instead, it was Margot. She stood there, the soft glow of the street lamp catching the curve of her cheek. Her coat was neatly belted, and her dark hair framed her face, its waves brushing against the collar. She looked composed, but her eyes, those hazel eyes he couldn't seem to forget, were filled with an unease that belied her calm exterior. "Lucien," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I hope I'm not intruding." He blinked, caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" "Can I come in?" she asked, glancing past him at the cluttered space. He hesitated before stepping aside, holding the door open without a word. She entered cautiously, her gaze sweeping the room. It was a far cry from the refined gallery settings she was accustomed to, but there was something honest about the disarray. It was raw, unfiltered, a reflection of Lucien himself. Margot turned to face him, her expression earnest. "I came because I need to talk to you." He crossed his arms, leaning back against the doorframe. "Haven't we said enough?" "Maybe," she admitted. "But I don't think we really listened." Lucien's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. She took a breath, her hands clasped in front of her as though she were steadying herself. "I owe you an apology," she began. "Not just for keeping the truth from you, but for how I handled things when it came out. I was scared, Lucien. Scared that if you knew everything, you'd look at me differently. And I was wrong to assume you couldn't handle it." He watched her, his expression unreadable. Her words were sincere, but the hurt and frustration he'd carried since the showcase hadn't fully abated. "You fooled me," he said quietly. "That's hard to forget." "I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to make things right." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out to him. Lucien frowned, his gaze shifting between her face and the envelope. "What is this?" "It's an invitation," she said. "To exhibit your work at my gallery." His brow furrowed. "Margot. Before you say no, just hear me out," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't charity, and it's not pity. It's a chance for people to see what I see in your work, raw talent, passion, and honesty. I'm not asking for anything in return. There are no strings, no conditions. I want to help." Lucien stared at the envelope, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of his pride pressing against the possibility of what she was offering. Part of him wanted to reject it outright, to tell her he didn't need her help. But another part, the quieter, more vulnerable part, wondered if accepting her offer might not be such a betrayal of his principles after all. "You don't have to decide right now," Margot said, sensing his hesitation. "Take your time. Think about it." He met her gaze, searching for any hint of ulterior motive. But all he saw was sincerity, and something else, something softer, almost pleading. She wasn't just offering him a professional opportunity. She was reaching out, trying to bridge the distance that had grown between them. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice low. "It's hard to separate your offer from everything else." "I understand," she said. "But I hope you'll try. Because I believe in you, Lucien. And not because of what you've been through or what you're fighting against, but because of who you are." Her words landed heavily, stirring something in him he wasn't ready to name. He looked away, his gaze falling on the half-finished sculpture he'd been working on earlier. The shape was rough, undefined, but there was potential there, just as there was in what Margot was offering. She took a step back toward the door, sensing that her presence was becoming overwhelming. "I should go," she said. "I've said what I came to say." Lucien looked at her then, his eyes conflicted. "Why are you doing this, Margot?" Her lips parted, and for a moment, she seemed unsure how to answer. Then she smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in her expression. "Because I care about you. And because I want to believe that something good can come from all of this." He didn't respond, his throat tight with words he couldn't quite bring himself to say. She opened the door, pausing in the frame to look back at him. "Good night, Lucien," she said softly. He nodded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Good night." When the door clicked shut behind her, the studio felt impossibly quiet. Lucien stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope she had left on the table. The conflict within him was almost unbearable. He wanted to protect himself, to shield his pride from what felt like another blow. But her words lingered, weaving themselves into his thoughts like threads of light through the darkness. He moved to the table and picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. The edges were crisp, the handwriting on the front neat and deliberate. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a gesture of trust, an olive branch. And as much as he wanted to dismiss it, he couldn't ignore the way it made him feel. Setting the envelope down, he glanced at the unfinished sculpture once more. It wasn't just a block of stone, it was a reflection of his own struggle, his own potential. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and sat down at the workbench. His tools were still there, waiting for him. Lucien didn't know what he would do with Margot's offer. But as his hands began to move, he allowed himself a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth salvaging. The gallery was alive with energy, the warm light from ornate chandeliers casting a golden glow over the bustling crowd. Guests moved through the space, their conversations blending into a low hum punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Lucien stepped inside, his breath catching at the sight of his sculptures displayed with such care and reverence. Spotlights illuminated each piece, emphasizing every curve and texture he had poured himself into. It was surreal to see them like this, no longer rough and unfinished in his cluttered studio but celebrated, admired. He adjusted his tie, the unfamiliar fabric making him feel slightly out of place despite Jules's assurance that he cleaned up well. As he walked through the gallery, snippets of conversations reached his ears. "This piece is extraordinary," one guest murmured, gesturing toward a sculpture of intertwined hands. "The emotion is palpable." "The detail here," another remarked, leaning in to examine the subtle imperfections Lucien had deliberately left in a bust, "it's so raw, so human." Lucien's heart swelled, but his nerves remained close to the surface. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. His hands, usually steady when sculpting, fidgeted at his sides as he nodded politely to guests who complimented his work. Across the room, Margot lingered near the edges of the crowd, her posture poised but her heart racing. She had chosen a simple black dress, elegant in its understatement, wanting nothing to detract from the night's true focus, Lucien. She watched him move through the crowd, his humility evident in every shy smile and quiet thank you. He belonged here, she thought, even if he didn't realize it yet. When Lucien finally spotted her, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Her lips curved into a soft smile, one that carried encouragement and pride, and he nodded slightly before turning back to the couple in front of him. Margot let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her fingers lightly grazing the stem of her champagne flute. She had done everything she could to bring this night to life, but whether Lucien truly believed he deserved it was a question only he could answer. As the evening continued, the crowd gathered near a small platform at the center of the gallery. Jules, ever the enthusiastic supporter, clinked his glass to get everyone's attention before introducing Lucien. The applause was warm, a mixture of genuine admiration and polite encouragement, as Lucien stepped onto the platform. His pulse quickened, and he took a moment to steady himself, scanning the sea of faces until his gaze landed on Margot once again. She gave him a reassuring nod, and he drew strength from it. "Thank you," he began, his voice a little unsteady but filled with sincerity. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Seeing this room filled with people who appreciate art, who care about the stories behind it, means more to me than I can express." He paused, glancing at his hands as if gathering his thoughts. "For years, I worked alone in a tiny studio, wondering if what I created would ever matter to anyone beyond myself. I doubted my work, doubted whether I even had the right to call myself an artist. But tonight, standing here, seeing my sculptures in this beautiful space, I realized that belief in yourself and your work, doesn't always come from within. Sometimes, it comes from the people who see you before you can see yourself." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "There are many people I could thank for helping me get here, but one person in particular has shown me what it means to be believed in. Margot," he said, his eyes locking on hers, "you saw something in me when I wasn't sure it was there. You gave me the chance to show this side of myself to the world. And for that, I'm forever grateful." The room erupted into applause, but for Lucien, it all faded into the background as he held Margot's gaze. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, her lips slightly parted as though she was trying to find the right response. Then she smiled, a quiet, almost wistful smile that spoke volumes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, introductions, and polite small talk. But as the crowd began to thin, Lucien found himself gravitating toward the terrace just off the gallery. The night air was crisp but not cold, the lights of Paris twinkling in the distance. He leaned against the railing, letting the quiet wrap around him like a balm. He didn't hear Margot approach, but he felt her presence before she spoke. "Quite the speech," she said softly, stepping up beside him. He turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I meant every word." She looked down, her fingers brushing the railing. "I wasn't sure if you'd ever forgive me. After everything." Lucien exhaled, his gaze shifting to the cityscape. "I was angry," he admitted. "And hurt. But tonight, seeing what you've done for me, I can't hold on to that anger. You didn't just give me an opportunity. You gave me a reason to believe in what I do." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes luminous in the soft glow of the streetlights. "You've always been worth believing in, Lucien. I didn't create your talent or your vision. I just helped other people see what was already there." Her words lingered in the air between them, and Lucien turned fully to face her. "You keep saying it's about me, but Margot, it's about you too. You've made me see things differently. You've made me want to be better, not just as an artist, but as a person." She held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lucien," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been scared to let anyone in for so long. I've built walls, convinced myself that no one could ever see me beyond my last name. But you make me feel seen. Truly seen." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out hesitantly to touch hers. You are, Margot. I see you. Her breath hitched, and she smiled, a smile filled with hope, vulnerability, and something more profound. I care about you, Lucien. More than I ever thought I could. His fingers tightened gently around hers. I care about you too. For a moment, they simply stood there, the world around them falling away. Then, slowly, he leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their kiss was tender, unhurried, and filled with unspoken promises. The soft glow of the city lights framed them, a quiet testament to the connection they had fought so hard to find. When they pulled apart, Margot rested her forehead against his, her smile radiant and her heart full. Neither of them spoke, but in the silence, there was a sense of understanding. Together, they turned to face the city, the night stretching before them, rich with possibility. The corner of Rue des Artistes was no longer just another quiet street in Paris. The soft hum of life poured out from an open doorway, where the newly painted sign above read Atelier Lumière. Inside, the studio brimmed with energy in the faint but comforting scent of clay, paint, and varnish. Young artists filled the space, their laughter and chatter weaving through the air as they worked at easels, potter's wheels, and long communal tables. The space itself was an embodiment of creativity, light streaming through tall windows, splashing across walls adorned with half-finished sketches and splashes of color. Lucien stood in the center, watching it all with a quiet pride he couldn't quite put into words. The months of renovating the old building, filling it with equipment and possibilities, had been grueling, but every moment had been worth it. He had created something real, something meaningful, and seeing it alive with energy filled him with a satisfaction no amount of gallery accolades ever could. This was his dream, but it wasn't his alone. Margot entered the room with her usual grace, her presence subtle but magnetic. She wore a soft green blouse and dark jeans, her hair loosely tied back, and carried an easy smile that lit up the room as naturally as the sunlight streaming through the windows. A few of the young artists greeted her with warm familiarity, their gratitude evident in their voices. Though she had avoided becoming the face of the studio, her role in helping Lucien bring it to life was impossible to ignore. It was her steady encouragement and quiet wisdom that had propelled him when doubts threatened to slow him down. Lucien turned when he sensed her approach, his expression softening. "You're late," he teased, his tone light and playful. "I bring coffee," she replied, holding up 2 steaming cups. "Doesn't that make up for it?" He took one from her, the smile tugging at his lips making her heart flutter. "I guess I'll forgive you." They wandered through the studio together, hand in hand, as Lucien introduced her to some of the young artists. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their gratitude spilling over in excited descriptions of their projects and ideas. Margot listened with genuine interest, her questions thoughtful, her encouragement sincere. Lucien watched her with a sense of wonder, reminded once again of how seamlessly she had become part of this world, his world. As they reached the far corner of the studio, Lucien paused beside a pedestal where one of his newest sculptures stood. It was a figure of a woman, poised yet unguarded, her expression gentle but resolute. The lines of the piece were both strong and delicate, every curve a reflection of care and admiration. Margot's breath caught as she realized it was her. She touched the edge of the sculpture lightly, her fingers grazing the smooth surface as though afraid to disturb it. "Lucien," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and emotion. "You made this?" He nodded, his eyes on her rather than the piece. "It felt right. You've been such a big part of this journey. I wanted you to see how much you mean to me." Her gaze flicked to his, and she saw the vulnerability in his expression. She smiled, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just know that, this studio, this life we're building, it wouldn't exist without you." Her heart swelled at his words, the sincerity behind them resonating deeply. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, and they stood together for a moment, the hum of the studio around them a quiet backdrop to their shared silence. As the day gave way to evening, the studio gradually emptied. The young artists packed up their supplies, their goodbyes punctuated with laughter and promises to return. Lucien and Margot locked up together, stepping out into the crisp Parisian night. The streets were quieter now, the city glowing softly under the scattered lights of lampposts and windows. They walked side by side, their hands intertwined, the rhythm of their steps unhurried. Lucien glanced at Margot, her profile serene in the golden light. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "there were times when I thought this dream wasn't possible. When I felt like it was too far away to reach." She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What changed?" "You," he said simply. "You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And it made all the difference." Her lips parted slightly, her chest tightening at the weight of his words. She thought of how long she had kept herself guarded, convinced that no one could see past her last name, and how Lucien had proven her wrong in ways she never expected. "I think we've both found something we didn't know we needed," she said quietly. "You've given me a kind of peace I didn't think I'd ever have." They stopped walking, turning to face each other under the soft glow of a nearby street lamp. Lucien reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, his expression open and unguarded. "I'm not sure where this all leads," he said. "But I know I want to share it with you." Margot smiled, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Then let's share it. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out. Together." He leaned in, their foreheads touching briefly before their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and sure. It wasn't a moment of dramatic declarations or fireworks, it was something quieter, steadier. It was trust and hope and the promise of a future they would build together. When they pulled back, Margot laughed softly, her cheeks flushed. "You know," she said, her tone playful, "you're getting better at this romantic gesture thing." Lucien chuckled, the sound low and warm. "I have a good muse." They continued walking, the quiet of the city wrapping around them like a favorite coat. As they passed the corner where the studio sign shone faintly in the distance, Lucien gave Margot's hand a gentle squeeze. His heart felt lighter than it had in years, not because his dream was finally real, but because he had someone to share it with. Margot glanced at him, her own heart full. For so long, she had wondered if love could ever feel uncomplicated, if it could be something that didn't ask her to choose between who she was and who she wanted to be. With Lucien, she had found that balance, a love that didn't diminish her but made her feel more whole. They paused at the edge of the Seine, the river flowing quietly beneath them, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. Lucien wrapped his arm around Margot's shoulders, pulling her close. Neither spoke, but they didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with understanding, a quiet celebration of the journey that had brought them here. As the night stretched on, they turned away from the river, their laughter mingling with the soft sounds of the city. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they walked forward together, their story one of love, growth, and the beauty of finding something extraordinary in the most unexpected places.